The strangers in the alley. Commander Lewis moved carefully through the ruined streets, his boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The colony had been silent for days. Once, this place had been full of life. Markets, children laughing, workers rushing to their jobs. Now there was nothing but ash, empty buildings, and the stench of death. His breath formed a mist in the cold air as he scanned his surroundings. Someone was watching him. He could feel it. The war had been brutal. He had seen too many planets turned into graveyards. But this colony was different. It had not fallen to soldiers or bombs. It had starved. Lewis tightened his grip on his rifle and moved toward a narrow alley between two collapsed buildings. A noise. Soft, faint, a rustling sound, like someone trying to stay hidden. He raised his rifle. Come out. Silence. Then a shadow moved. From the darkness, a woman stepped forward. She was thin, too thin, her body weak from hunger. Her long, tattered cloak barely covered her skeletal frame. Behind her, two small children peeked out. Their eyes were wide with fear. They weren't human. Lewis recognized their species, carrions. Their skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. Once proud warriors, now nothing more than ghosts. The mother pulled the children behind her and lowered her head. Her hands shook as she raised them in a defensive gesture. She expected him to kill them. Lewis lowered his weapon slightly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice calm but firm. The woman didn't respond. She just stared, her sunken eyes filled with exhaustion. The children clung to her cloak, too weak to even shiver in the cold. Lewis hesitated. He had seen this before. Starving survivors, too broken to even beg. He reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar. The last one he had. Slowly, carefully, he extended it toward her. The mother flinched. Her breathing quickened, her hands clenched into fists. She stared at the food like it was a trick, a trap. Then her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, her thin body trembling. Her eyes filled with tears, silent, painful tears that streamed down her hollow cheeks. Lewis watched as she struggled to hold herself together. She wanted to stay strong for her children, but her body had nothing left. The smallest child, a girl no older than 5, crawled forward. She looked at the ration bar, then at Lewis. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lewis did something no soldier would ever do on an enemy planet. He placed his rifle on the ground. The mother gasped softly. The little girl looked up at him, confused. Still moving slow, Lewis pushed the food toward them and stepped back, far enough to show he wasn't a threat. The girl hesitated, then reached out and grabbed the ration bar. She tore at the wrapper with weak fingers, and within seconds, she was eating like she had never seen food before. Her mother covered her mouth, shaking. Lewis saw something in her eyes that he had never seen in an enemy before. Not just fear, not just pain. Disbelief. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry leaves. Lewis didn't answer. He just reached into his pack and pulled out another ration bar. The last of his food. He tossed it toward her feet. The woman's lips trembled. She looked at the food, then back at him. And then she broke down completely. Not in words, not in thanks. Just silent, racking sobs. The kind that came from someone who had held on for too long and finally let go. Lewis turned his head slightly, pretending not to see. He understood. Some wounds had no words. The other child, a boy, crawled closer and wrapped his thin arms around his mother. The little girl kept eating, but this time she paused. She looked up at Lewis and did something unexpected. She held out the half-eaten ration bar. Lewis felt something tighten in his chest. He shook his head. "Keep it." The girl hesitated, then nodded and went back to eating. The alley was silent again, except for the sound of chewing and quiet sobs. Lewis stood up and picked up his rifle. He knew they wouldn't trust him yet. Maybe they never would. But as he turned to scan the streets, he felt something. A presence. Someone was watching them. And whoever it was not friendly. The breaking point. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the scent of burnt metal, dust, and death. The mother still knelt on the ground, her frail body trembling as silent sobs racked her frame. The little girl clutched the half-eaten ration bar in one hand while holding onto her mother with the other. The boy sat still, his large, hollow eyes fixed on Lewis. Commander Lewis stood motionless, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the alley. Something was wrong. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him. It crept up his spine like ice, setting every nerve on edge. The mother wiped her eyes, trying to regain control of herself. She had to be strong. She had to survive. She swallowed back her tears and looked up at Lewis, eyes filled with something more than just fear. Confusion, distrust, and something deeper, something fragile. Hope. "Why?" she whispered again. Her voice was so soft that it was almost lost in the wind. Lewis didn't answer immediately. What could he say? That he was tired of seeing innocent people suffer. That he had seen too many worlds reduced to nothing. That, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to do something different, something human. Instead, he just shrugged. "You needed food." The mother flinched, as if the simplicity of his answer hurt more than any lie. She had expected cruelty, not kindness. Not from a human. She shook her head, wiping away the last of her tears. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the ration bar he had tossed to her earlier. Her hand still trembled, but she forced herself to take a small bite. For the first time in days, she ate. The little girl smiled, watching her mother chew. The boy, however, didn't take his eyes off Lewis. He wasn't scared. He was studying him. Then Lewis heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, measured. Not just one person. Multiple. His instincts screamed at him. They weren't alone. The mother heard it too. Her body tensed, her hands gripping her children, as she shrank back into the shadows. Lewis raised his rifle, turning toward the entrance of the alley. The darkness seemed to breathe. Then, they appeared. 4 figures stepped into the alley, their silhouettes sharp against the dim light of the ruined city. They weren't human. They were scavengers. Thin, dangerous, and desperate. Their leader, a tall, scared alien with dark, sunken eyes, smirked. Well, the alien's voice was smooth, almost amused. "What do we have here?" Lewis didn't lower his weapon. He knew exactly what they were. These weren't just looters. They were predators. They didn't come to steal food. They came to hunt. The leader tilted his head, eyes scanning the scene. His gaze landed on the mother and her children, his smirk widening. "Ah," he said softly, stepping forward. "So this is where you ran." Lewis didn't move, but he could feel the mother's terror behind him. She wasn't just scared. She knew them. The boy made a small sound, a whimper. The mother tightened her grip on him, her breathing sharp and ragged. The leader's smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew. "You shouldn't have left, Riza," he said, addressing the mother. "You knew what would happen if you ran." Lewis' mind clicked. This wasn't just some random scavenger gang. They had been hunting her. The mother, Riza, didn't answer. Her whole body was shaking now. But Lewis could see it in her eyes. She would rather die than go back. The leader turned his gaze to Lewis. His smirk remained, but his voice grew sharper. "And you," he said, "a human soldier, helping them. That's new." Lewis said nothing. He didn't lower his weapon, didn't even blink. The leader's smirk twitched. He didn't like the silence. "You must be confused," the alien continued. "You see, these things." He gestured toward the mother and children. "They belong to us." Lewis didn't react. His grip on the rifle remained steady. The leader's amusement finally cracked, his eyes narrowing. "I'll make this simple, human." He took another step forward, Walk away. Now. Lewis exhaled slowly. They were testing him. They thought he would back down. They thought wrong. He tilted his head slightly. And if I don't? The leader chuckled, shaking his head. You think you can stop us? Lewis didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, just enough for his finger to rest against the trigger. The leader's smirk returned. You won't shoot. Lewis didn't move, didn't blink. The leader took another step. You're just one man. You can't save them. And let's be honest. The gunshot cracked through the air. The scavenger beside the leader collapsed instantly, blood spraying the ground. The mother gasped. The children froze. The alley went dead silent. The leader slowly turned his head, staring at his fallen comrade. For the first time, his smirk disappeared. Lewis lowered his rifle slightly, the barrel still smoking. His expression didn't change. Try me, he said coldly. The remaining scavengers shifted nervously. Their leader, however, stayed perfectly still. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, the leader's lip curled into something between a snarl and a forced smile. Fine, he muttered. We'll see how long you last. With that, he turned and walked away. The others hesitated, but eventually followed. Their footsteps faded into the night. Lewis didn't move until he was sure they were gone. Then he turned. The mother, Riza, was staring at him, eyes wide with shock. You? Killed for us, she whispered. Lewis looked down at the fallen scavenger, then back at her. His voice was calm, steady. No. He met her gaze. I killed because I had to. The shadow in the dark. The body lay still. A pool of dark blood seeped into the cracks of the broken ground, steaming in the cold night air. The echo of the gunshot had faded, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the ruined colony. Commander Lewis didn't move. His rifle remained raised, his breathing steady. The mother, Riza, held her children tightly, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She had seen death before, but never like this. Never for her. The scavenger leader, the one with the scared face and cold eyes, stood frozen for a moment. His smirk had vanished. He looked down at his fallen companion, then back at Lewis. Then he did something strange. He laughed. It was a soft, low chuckle at first, but it grew into something almost amused. You're making a mistake, human. His voice was calm, but there was something dark beneath it. Lewis still didn't lower his weapon. He had heard threats like this before. You have no idea what you've done, the leader continued, his gaze shifting to Riza. She belongs to us. She ran, but that doesn't change the deal. Riza flinched. Lewis caught the movement. There was something here he didn't understand. The scavenger's smirk returned, but it wasn't the same. It was colder now, sharper. You think one bullet changes anything? He raised his hand. The remaining two scavengers behind him instantly stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the ruins. Then, without another word, the leader turned and walked away, vanishing into the night. Lewis didn't follow. He didn't fire. Something felt off. He listened for their movements, but after a few seconds, there was only silence. Too silent. Riza slowly rose to her feet. Her face was pale, and her arms clutched her children tightly. Her whole body was shaking. You should have let them take us, she whispered. Lewis frowned. What did they mean? The deal. Riza swallowed hard. Her fingers dug into her own arms as if she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. She wouldn't meet his eyes. It doesn't matter now, she muttered. Lewis didn't believe that for a second. Before he could press further, the boy, the older of the two children, suddenly tensed. His large, dark eyes darted past Lewis, into the ruined buildings. Then his expression changed. Fear. Lewis didn't hesitate. He turned, raising his rifle. Nothing. Only darkness. The colony ruins stretched before them, silent and still. Broken walls, Abandoned streets, shadows deep enough to hide anything. Lewis narrowed his eyes. The scavengers had left too easily. No fighting, no chasing, no revenge. They weren't done. "Move," he ordered. His voice was sharper now. "We need to get out of here." Riza hesitated, but when she saw the tension in Lewis' stance, she obeyed. She took the little girl's hand, pulling her close. The boy stayed at her side, his eyes darting around them. They started moving, stepping carefully over rubble and shattered glass. The wind whistled through the buildings, making the wreckage groan like something alive. Lewis kept his rifle raised, scanning every alley, every doorway. His gut told him they weren't alone, and he had learned to trust his gut. The boy suddenly tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Shadows," he whispered. Lewis barely caught the word, but he didn't need to hear it again. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then he saw it. A figure moved in the distance, not from the direction the scavengers had left, but from the opposite side of the ruins. Something else was here. Lewis stopped. He held up a hand. Riza froze. The children clung to her cloak, their breaths quick and shallow. Lewis watched the figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it wasn't a scavenger. The way it moved was different, smoother, controlled. And then it stopped moving. Lewis felt it. A gaze, cold and unblinking, watching, calculating. He raised his rifle. A second figure stepped into view. Then a third. Then a fourth. The boy whimpered, clutching his mother's arm. Riza's voice was barely above a breath. "Not them. Please, not them." Lewis glanced at her. Who? But he already knew the answer. These weren't scavengers. They were hunters. The first figure took a slow step forward. No hesitation. No fear. Their bodies were covered in sleek, black armor, designed not for war, but for something worse. Tracking. Hunting. Taking. The leader of the scavengers had been a distraction. These were the real ones coming for Riza. And they weren't leaving without her. Lewis exhaled. His mind worked fast. 4 targets, unknown weapons, a scared mother and 2 children who couldn't run fast enough. His rifle was ready, but deep inside, he knew he wouldn't win a direct fight. He needed a plan. Fast. The hunters took another step forward. Then the lead figure raised a hand and pointed straight at Riza. "You belong to us," the hunter said, his voice hollow. "Come quietly, and we won't hurt the children." Riza's breath hitched. The little girl whimpered. The boy squeezed his mother's arm. Lewis pulled the trigger. The first shot slammed into the hunter's chest, but instead of dropping, the impact barely made them flinch. "Armor. Run," Lewis snapped, stepping forward to shield Riza and the children. But she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen. And in that split second, Lewis realized something. She wasn't afraid to die. She was afraid of what would happen if they took her alive. The hunters moved, fast. Lewis fired again, this time aiming for the head. The fight had begun. The price of mercy. The first shot rang out like thunder in the dead city. Lewis had aimed for the head. A clean, lethal shot. But the bullet didn't do what it was supposed to. Instead of piercing through flesh, the round hit the hunter's helmet and sparked off harmlessly. The figure barely even flinched. Lewis felt his gut tighten. Not good. The hunter turned its head slightly, as if acknowledging the attack, then continued walking toward them without a word. The others followed. Riza stood frozen, her breath short and uneven. "No, no, no," she whispered. Lewis didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time at the legs. The bullet struck, but the armor absorbed the impact. Dan, these weren't just scavengers in scrap armor. These were professionals. Hunters, slave takers. And they weren't here to kill. They were here to collect. Lewis didn't need to guess who their target was. "Move, he barked. grabbing Riza's arm. She didn't resist. Her body finally reacted, and she yanked the children into motion. They ran, fast, desperate, stumbling over the cracked streets. But the hunters were faster. Lewis barely had time to turn before the first one lunged at him. The black armored figure moved with terrifying precision, closing the gap in seconds. Lewis only had a split second to react. He swung the butt of his rifle, hard. Crack. The hit connected, but the hunter barely staggered. Lewis barely managed to duck as a fist shot out toward his head, missing him by an inch. The air around the punch shuddered, like the very force of it could have shattered bone if it had landed. Enhanced strength. Great, just great. Lewis didn't have time to play defense. He needed to end this quickly. He reached for his sidearm, a heavier caliber pistol, armor-piercing rounds. Before he could fire, the second hunter moved. Something whipped through the air. A cable. Thin, metallic, fast. Lewis barely had time to react before it wrapped around his wrist and yanked. Hard. Pain shot through his arm as he was jerked forward, his balance ripped from under him. He hit the ground with a hard thud, skidding across rubble. The pistol flew from his grip. Damn it. He rolled just in time to avoid a heavy boot slamming down where his head had been. He needed to get up. Fast. But the moment he pushed himself up, the first hunter was already on him. Fast. Too fast. The armored figure grabbed his jacket, lifting him effortlessly into the air. Lewis barely had time to process the strength behind the movement before he was thrown. Hard. He hit a collapsed wall with a sharp crack. His body screamed in pain. His vision blurred. He had taken worse. But this was bad. He needed to stall. "You're really putting in the effort," Lewis coughed, forcing himself to sit up. "All this trouble for one person." The lead hunter tilted his head slightly. "She is not a person," he said simply. "She is property." Riza froze mid-run. Lewis felt something dark inside him twist. Before he could respond, a scream cut through the air. The boy. Lewis' blood ran cold. He turned just in time to see one of the hunters grab the child by the arm, lifting him effortlessly. The little girl screamed, clinging to her mother. Riza didn't think. She moved. She grabbed a sharp piece of debris from the ground and rushed forward like a wild animal. She slammed the jagged metal into the hunter's side, aiming for the gaps in the armor. The weapon hit deep. The hunter jerked back in pain. The boy fell to the ground, scrambling backward. Riza turned, but she wasn't fast enough. A hand wrapped around her throat. She choked, her feet lifting off the ground. The hunter held her up like she weighed nothing. She struggled, kicking, clawing, gasping. But the grip only tightened. Lewis didn't have time to think. He reacted. He reached to his belt, grabbed his last flash grenade, and pulled the pin. "Close your eyes," he shouted. The children obeyed instantly. Riza couldn't. The grenade exploded, a blinding white light flooding the alley. The hunters staggered back. Their helmets dimmed the blast, but it was enough to loosen their grip. Riza dropped to the ground, coughing violently. Lewis didn't give the hunters a second to recover. He lunged. Grabbing Riza, he pulled her up and shoved her toward the children. "Run." She didn't argue. She grabbed both of them and bolted into the shadows. Lewis turned back. The hunters were already recovering. The lead figure looked at him. His voice was calm, unbothered. "This will not stop us." Lewis breathed heavily. His ribs ached. His arm throbbed. He was running out of options. He glanced toward the ruins. A plan formed in his mind. He looked back at the lead hunter and smirked. "It doesn't have to," he said. Then, he ran the other way. Straight into the ruins. The hunters followed. Lewis didn't need to win. He just needed to buy them time. And he had one last trick left. A dangerous choice. Lewis ran. The ruined city blurred past him, darkened alleys flashing by as his boots pounded against the cracked pavement. His breaths came sharp and fast, but he forced himself forward. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Behind him, the hunters were gaining ground. Their footsteps were silent. Too precise, too controlled, but Lewis could hear them. The way the rubble shifted slightly under their weight, the way the wind whispered around their armored forms. They were fast, faster than any human, and they were hunting him. Lewis had only seconds to act. He wasn't going to outrun them. He needed a plan. Up ahead, a collapsed building formed a natural choke point, a narrow corridor between two shattered walls. It was perfect. Lewis skidded into the alley, pressing himself into the shadows. He reached into his belt, feeling for his last explosive charge. It wasn't much, just a small high-pressure detonation pack meant for breaching doors. But in the right place, at the right time, it could be deadly. He placed the charge against the weakest part of the wall. Then he did something reckless. He stopped running. The hunters arrived seconds later. They didn't hesitate. The moment they saw him, they moved. The first one lunged. Lewis rolled to the side at the last second. The hunter's momentum carried him forward, right past the charge. Perfect. Lewis slammed his fist down on the detonator. Boom. The explosion was small, but it was enough. The weakened wall collapsed instantly, sending tons of stone and steel crashing down. Dust and debris filled the alleyway as the shockwave threw Lewis backward. He hit the ground hard, coughing as rubble rained down around him. His ears rang. His vision blurred. But when he pushed himself up, he saw what he needed to see. The alley was now a wall of debris, completely blocked. The hunters were trapped on the other side. Lewis didn't stay to watch. He turned and ran. The others. Riza ran as fast as she could, gripping the children's hands. Her lungs burned, her legs felt weak. But she didn't stop. She knew better than to stop. The little girl was crying, struggling to keep up. The boy was silent, but his grip was tight. He was scared. They all were. But Lewis had bought them a chance, and she wouldn't waste it. She turned a corner, leading them through a collapsed marketplace. Scattered crates, broken stalls, abandoned vehicles. Somewhere ahead, safety. She just had to reach it. Then, a shadow moved. Riza froze. Something stepped out from the ruins. Not a scavenger. Not a hunter. Something worse. A figure stood there, watching them. It was tall, lean, draped in tattered cloth. Its skin was grayish-black, its eyes glowing dimly in the darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she had seen before. And it was waiting. She took a step back, shielding the children. The figure tilted its head slightly. Then, it raised a hand. A whisper, soft, almost a breath. Run. Riza's blood turned to ice. Then, a sound from behind. She turned and nearly screamed. Another figure had appeared behind them. And then another. Silent, watching, waiting. She wasn't sure how many there were, but they were everywhere. The boy grabbed her sleeve. Mama. Riza felt her heart pounding. They were trapped. And these things weren't here to help. She swallowed hard. Then, a noise cut through the air. A voice. Familiar. K-E-P-M-O-V-N. Riza turned. Lewis was there. Alive, armed, and running toward them. The figures didn't react. They simply watched. And Lewis, he didn't hesitate. He fired. The escape. The first shot hit the nearest figure, and the thing dissolved into smoke. Not flesh, not armor. Something else. Something wrong. Lewis didn't stop. He grabbed Riza's arm, pulling her forward. Go. Now. She didn't argue. They ran. The figures didn't follow. They didn't move at all. They just watched. And as Lewis turned back one last time, he realized something terrifying. They weren't stopping them. They were letting them go. like a game, like a hunt, like they wanted this to last longer. Lewis gritted his teeth. They needed to get out of here. Ahead, his ship waited. Safety, or at least a chance to fight back. They had survived the hunters, but something worse was coming, and it wasn't done with them yet. The journey to safety. The wind howled through the broken city, carrying the scent of ash, rust, and something worse, something ancient. Lewis gritted his teeth as he led them through the ruins. His rifle was raised, his body tense, every nerve in his body screaming that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Behind him, Risa clutched her children's hands, their small footsteps hurried but unsteady. The boy's breathing was ragged. The girl's sobs were muffled against her mother's cloak. They were exhausted, terrified, but they kept moving. Because they had no other choice. The figures, the ones made of smoke and shadows, had let them go. They hadn't chased. They hadn't attacked. And that was what scared Lewis the most. Predators didn't abandon prey, unless they were playing with it. Ahead, the city stretched into darkness. Lewis' ship was waiting somewhere beyond the ruins. If they could reach it, they could escape. But that was a big if. And Lewis knew it. He glanced back. Risa's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously at every shadow. She was waiting for something to happen. She wasn't alone. Lewis didn't like this. It was too quiet. And in war, silence was never a good thing. The road ahead. They moved through a collapsed marketplace, stepping over shattered glass and broken crates. The remnants of a life long gone. Once, this place had been full of voices, trade, and laughter. Now, only ghosts remained. The silence pressed down on them. Even the wind had died. Risa's voice was barely above a whisper. They're still watching. Lewis didn't look back. He already knew. He could feel it. That crawling sensation in the back of his mind, the weight of unseen eyes. They weren't alone. He stopped suddenly, raising a fist. A soldier's signal. Risa halted. The children huddled close. Ahead, a noise. A slow, rhythmic tapping. Metal against stone. Lewis raised his rifle. His grip was steady, but inside, his mind raced. Something was waiting for them. And it wasn't friendly. The ambush. The tapping grew louder, deliberate, mocking. Then, a shape stepped into the open. Tall, cloaked in ragged armor. A scavenger, but different. His body was lined with cybernetic implants, his arms unnaturally long, his fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. A grin split his scared face. Well, he rasped. The human made it this far. Lewis didn't lower his weapon. His mind was already working through every possible way this could go. It wasn't just one. From the surrounding ruins, more emerged. At least 10. All armed. All hungry. Scavengers, not the ones from before, but no less dangerous. Lewis exhaled slowly. He had walked them right into a trap. The leader stepped forward, tilting his head as he eyed Risa. I see why they wanted you back, he mused. His voice was cold amusement. Risa's hands clenched into fists. She said nothing. The scavenger chuckled, turning his gaze back to Lewis. Tell me, soldier, how much is she worth to you? Lewis' grip on his rifle tightened. Not for sale. The scavenger grinned. Oh, I wasn't asking. Then, they attacked. The fight for survival. It happened in seconds. The scavengers lunged, too fast, too coordinated. Lewis fired first. His rifle barked, taking down the nearest attacker. 1 down. 9 left. Risa shoved the children behind a metal crate, shielding them with her body. Lewis moved. His instincts took over. Duck. Pivot. Fire. A blade swung past his face. He dodged, bringing his rifle up, a brutal strike to the attacker's head. Another scavenger grabbed his arm. Lewis twisted, a sharp elbow to the throat. The attacker staggered back, gasping. But there were too many. A heavy impact slammed into his side. Lewis hit the ground hard, pain flaring through his ribs. Two scavengers pinned him down, their weapons raised. Too slow. The leader loomed over him, grinning. "You should have taken the deal." He raised his blade. Then, a scream. Not from Lewis. From above. A shape dropped from the rooftops. Something black and fast. Something inhuman. Lewis barely had time to process it before the figure tore into the scavengers like a beast unleashed. Claws flashed. Bodies dropped. Blood sprayed. The scavengers screamed in panic. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the hunted. The leader staggered back, his face twisting in shock. No, wait. The shadowed figure lunged. The last thing Lewis saw was the leader's eyes, wide with terror, before darkness swallowed him. Then, silence. The AFTER. Lewis coughed, pushing himself up. His hands were covered in blood. But not his. The scavengers were dead. All of them. Riza and the children were untouched. But standing in the center of the carnage was one of the shadowed figures. Up close, it was terrifying. Tall, thin, its body wrapped in layers of black armor that seemed to shift like smoke. Its eyes, dark voids that seemed to pierce through everything. It stared at him. Then it spoke. Not in words, not in a voice. A whisper, in his mind. "You were not meant to survive this." Lewis clenched his jaw. His hands curled into fists. "And yet," he said, "here I am." The figure tilted its head, almost curious. Then it stepped back, and in a blink, it was gone. The ruins were silent once more. Lewis exhaled slowly. He turned to Riza. "We need to leave. Now." She nodded, gripping the children's hands. Ahead, the path to the ship was clear. But the real danger was just beginning. The last stand. The wind howled across the ruined city, carrying the scent of smoke, metal, and blood. Lewis wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. His ribs ached, his muscles screamed, but he couldn't stop now. Not when they were this close. The ship was just ahead. The Nightfall, his personal dropship, sat in the middle of an abandoned plaza, its sleek, battle-scarred hull reflecting the faint glow of the ruined city. 30 more steps. They would be safe. But Lewis wasn't a fool. Nothing came this easy. The final chase. Behind them, the city stirred. The shadows that had stalked them, the eerie figures that had toyed with their escape, were no longer playing. They were coming. Lewis knew it the moment the air shifted. A faint, vibrating hum pulsed through the ground, a sound just below hearing. Riza flinched. Her eyes darted around, frantic. She could feel it too. Then, a whisper. Not words, not a voice. Just a presence. Watching, waiting, hunting. Lewis grabbed Riza's arm. "Go, now." She didn't argue. She ran. The children followed, their small feet slapping against the pavement. Lewis moved with them, but his instincts screamed at him. Danger was closing in. And then, the sky flickered. For a split second, the stars above seemed to shudder. And the world went black. The hunters, revelmclvs, darkness swallowed everything. Not the natural kind. This was different. Alive. Crawling. Writhing. Lewis couldn't see his hands. Couldn't see the ship. Couldn't see anything. Riza gasped somewhere ahead. The children whimpered. Then, a footstep. Close. Too close. A voice, hollow and distant, whispered through the blackness. "You were warned." Lewis turned sharply, raising his rifle. A mistake. Something moved beside him, too fast to track. A hand, cold, unnatural, wrapped around his wrist. Before he could react, a force like ice shot through his arm. His body locked up. His rifle slipped from his grasp. Then the whisper came again, directly in his ear. "You do not belong here." And just as quickly as it came, the darkness vanished. The ambush. The world snapped back into focus. The plaza, the ship, the ruins. But now, they weren't alone. Figures stood in a perfect circle around them. Silent, watching, waiting. Lewis knew, deep in his gut, these were not scavengers, not soldiers, not even hunters. These things were something else entirely, and they had been waiting for this moment. Riza grabbed the children, her breath ragged. She knew what they were. Lewis didn't have time to ask. One of the figures stepped forward. Unlike the others, this one had a face, or rather, the echo of one. Its features shifted, flickering in and out of existence like a dying hologram. Not flesh, not machine. Something in between. It spoke. "Leave the woman. The children. Walk away." Lewis exhaled slowly, his hands clenched into fists. This was the choice. They weren't offering a fight. They were offering a deal. Leave Riza and the children, and he could live. Riza trembled. She wouldn't beg, but her eyes said everything. Lewis turned his gaze to the figures, and he smiled. Wrong guy. Then, he moved. The final battle. Lewis dove for his rifle. The moment his fingers wrapped around the grip, chaos erupted. The figures lunged, moving like liquid shadows, too fast for the eye to track. Lewis fired. The bullets tore through the first one. Black smoke erupted from its body. But it didn't fall. He rolled, switching to his sidearm. Armor-piercing rounds. 2 shots. The second figure staggered back, flickering like a broken projection. Then, they swarmed. One of them struck from behind. Lewis barely dodged, but pain exploded across his side. Claws. Sharp. Cutting. Blood dripped down his ribs. He gritted his teeth. Not done yet. Riza moved. She wasn't a soldier, but she had spent her life running. Surviving. She grabbed a fallen scavenger's blade and slashed. The nearest figure jerked back, hissing. The boy, not even 10 years old, grabbed a broken pipe and swung wildly at another. They weren't warriors, but they refused to be taken. Lewis pushed forward. A burst of gunfire. Another figure fell. But more kept coming. This wasn't a fight they could win. They needed to end it. And fast. They last gamble. Lewis saw one chance. A power relay, half buried in the rubble near his ship. If he could overload it, it would trigger an EMP pulse. It wouldn't kill them, but it might give them enough time to escape. He didn't hesitate. He ran. The figures moved to intercept, but Riza threw herself in their path. She screamed as they knocked her down, but she bought Lewis the time he needed. He reached the relay, yanking a grenade from his belt. One chance. One throw. He pulled the pin and let it fly. The grenade slammed into the relay. Boom. A surge of white-hot energy erupted through the air. The figures froze. Their bodies flickered violently. The entire world shook. Lewis didn't wait to see if it worked. He grabbed Riza, hauled her up. The kids were already scrambling for the ship. They ran. They hit the ramp, stumbled inside. Lewis slammed his fist against the launch controls. Engines roared. The ship lifted off. Below them, the figures stood motionless. Their faces, if they even had faces, were unreadable. They had lost. But somehow, Lewis knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The final words. As the ship broke atmosphere, Riza slumped against the wall, exhausted. The boy clutched his sister, both silent. And Lewis? He leaned against the cockpit, staring at the stars. They had survived. But something deep in his gut told him, this was just the beginning. Riza's voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. You didn't have to help us." Lewis glanced at her. Then he smiled. "That's what humans do."